Hi. Today, I'd like to examine and compare the debut albums by what many people call the Big Four of the British invasion in the early mid-1960s. First, a brief explanation on my references. I'll be comparing the Beatles' UK debut album, the Rolling Stones' US debut album, and both the UK and US versions of the debut albums of The Who and the Kinks. I'm using this approach because that's how my CD copies of the albums are structured. And to explain why there's a difference in the first place, it was common practice in the 60s to release different versions of a UK band's albums in the US at that time. Record executives in the States had differing opinions about what would appeal to their target demographic, and restructured the albums accordingly. These chop jobs, as one might call them, didn't sit well with the artists at times, and by the late 60s the practice was mostly abandoned. The first to be released, Please Please Me by the Beatles, was released in March of 1963. It was considered groundbreaking due to its contents mostly having been recorded in one day-long recording session. This gave the album a live-in-the-studio feel and presented a cross-section of the band's typical live output at the time. Let's look deeper into the album tracks. Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You were recorded 5 months before the February 11th recording session that laid the groundwork for the rest of the album. Love Me Do has been one of the band's most enduring hits from their early period. The album's title track and its B-side, Ask Me Why, were recorded in late November of 1962. A recording exists of a session take of the former, with original drummer Pete Best. Do You Want to Know a Secret, while written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, featured George Harrison on lead vocals, and still gets a fair amount of airplay for one of the lesser songs from this album. Rounding out the hit originals on the album is I Saw Her Standing There, a high-energy opener. The last two originals, There's a Place and Misery, are, in my opinion, two of the most underrated Beatles songs in their entire catalog. As for the cover songs, I find Baby It's You and Anna Go to Him being decent, but not amazing covers. A Taste of Honey I actually didn't like all that much when I first heard it, but it's grown on me. The lyrics, interestingly enough, make for a good, if unintended, metaphor for addiction. Chains is a pretty fun cover and one of 3 songs that was an adapted girl group piece. The last of these 3, Boys, was Ringo's vocal piece on the album, and while it's drawn criticism over the years for being a dubious choice for the band to perform, it's been defended by Paul McCartney as being meant to appeal to the girls in the audience without any implications considered. Of course, the final cover and closing track is Twist and Shout, an Isley Brothers number. John Lennon nailed the vocal in one take before burning out his voice, so to speak. This was the final song recorded in the February 11th session, and John had been fighting a cold all day while powering through his vocals. Please Please Me topped the UK album charts in May of 1963 and stayed there for 30 weeks before the Beatles' second album, With the Beatles, took its place. The Rolling Stones' debut in the United States, England's newest hitmakers, is heavy on cover material. Of the 12 tracks, only 3 were originals. Tell Me You're Coming Back was the first band composition credited to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, and a fairly strong start to their songwriting partnership. However, the other 2 originals are jointly credited to the band under the pseudonym Nanker Felge. One of these, Now I've Got a Witness, is an instrumental companion piece to the cover song Can I Get a Witness, originally by Marvin Gaye. The other, Little by Little, is co-credited to the now recently deceased record producer and convict Phil Spector, who also plays maracas on the song. As for the covers, the US version of the album opens with Bo Diddley's Not Fade Away, which was also the band's first hit single in the States a few months before the album's release. For one of the shorter recordings from this album, I'd say it's one of their best. Among the other better covers here are Bobby Troups' Route 66, Rufus Thomas's Walkin' the Dog, Willie Dixon's I Just Want to Make Love to You, and Chuck Berry's Carol. The other 2 covers, Slim Harpo's I'm a King Bee and Gene Allison's You Can Make It If You Try, are decent. Mostly recorded over a 5-day stretch in early 1964, the US edition was released on May 30th, peaking at number 11 on the album charts and earning gold record status. The Kinks' almost self-titled debut features a track listing of mostly covers. However, one thing that is pervasive throughout the album is the rushed feel. Although it was recorded intermittently from January to August of 1964, the band wasn't given much time in studio for post-production on the recordings. Their second album, Kinda Kinks, has the same problem to a fuller extent. Anyway, the album interestingly covers a variety of subgenres of rock music. Mersey Beat on Just Can't Go to Sleep, I Took My Baby Home, and Stop Your Sobbing. Rhythm and Blues on Long Tall Shorty, So Mystifying, Cadillac, and Got Love If You Want It. Their first and most enduring hit song, You Really Got Me, has been classified as proto-punk. Two of the more criticized tracks, Bald Headed Woman and I've Been Driving on Bald Mountain, are derived from traditional American blues. Most of the remaining album tracks are more straightforward rock. One criticism I'd have to make about the album is that outside of a small handful of tracks, the album lacks the energy of the debut albums of the other big four bands. This is especially notable if you compare the Kinks and Beatles covers of Little Richard's Long Tall Sally. While the Kinks version was released first, the Beatles version arrived a few months later, and though it does follow the original a lot closer, I'd say that's a good thing. A song like that needs plenty of energy to stand out, whereas the Kinks version sounds a little too laid back. Back to the album. It was released in the UK in October of 1964. I haven't been able to dig up its chart performance, but from what I've read, many critics said that the band's songwriting capabilities were not up to the same quality as the Beatles and the Stones. I'd have to agree, although frontman Ray Davies would improve quickly. Finally, released in the UK on December 3rd, 1965, My Generation suffered from the same problem as the Kinks' debut. It was a rushed production, under the same producer no less, American Shel Talmy. The album was, and still is considered, a cornerstone of the British mod music scene. What was the mod scene, you might be asking? It was, and in some ways still is, a subculture that originated in the late 50s, centered around custom, well-tailored clothing, typically short hairstyles for guys and girls, the use of motorized scooters, and musically gravitated towards modern jazz and later R&B. The term mod was derived from the word modernist. In the early 60s, they often clashed with another popular subculture called the rockers, who favored motorcycles, longer hairstyles such as the pompadour, wearing leather jackets, and leaned musically towards early rock and roll and rockabilly. The early development of My Generation began while the Who were still very much a mod band, having briefly changed their name to the High Numbers for a brief stint before their new management convinced them to switch back. Among the earliest recordings were several cover songs, only 3 of which made it to the final album. James Brown's I Don't Mind and Please Please Please, and Bo Diddley's I'm a Man, the last of which was removed from the US release of the album due to being deemed too sexual. It was replaced on the US version with Circles, aka Instant Party. With the limitation imposed on how many covers they could include, main songwriter Pete Townshend was tasked with providing more material for the album. Most of the album's originals were recorded in October. Among the standouts are the album's title track, a pounding anthem of youth that I think still holds up today, The Kids Are All Right, which has become one of their more endearing early tunes, The Ox, a thundering instrumental co-written by Pete Townshend, John Entwistle, Keith Moon, and session pianist Nicky Hopkins, and finally A Legal Matter, an irony-laced, lightly peppered with misogyny piece about the concept of breach of promise. My Generation peaked at number 5 on the UK NME charts, that's the New Musical Express. Since its first release, it's been highly praised by a number of music critics and review sites. I'd have to say that My Generation is my favorite of the 4 albums. It benefits from being the last one recorded and released, not to mention that present here is a lot of The Who's characteristic sonic punch that has carried them since. In second place in my rankings would be Please Please Me. The Beatles' work as album artists was off to a great start, and not only helped secure their legacy, but also the broader legacy of pop and rock artists to come. Third, and this is by no means a bad thing, is the Rolling Stones' debut, England's newest hitmakers. It's a solid album, but compared to the 2 ranked above it, it feels a bit ordinary. The weakest of the 4 albums, in my opinion, is Kinks. It feels like the album is pulling in several musical directions at once, and I think that mostly had to do with what little time the band had to record it. Well, that's all for now. I may post videos of my overall personal rankings of each band's albums, although I plan to focus mainly on this year's big video project here in the next few months. Thanks for watching.